Diversity and Minority Affairs Committee and Accommodations Committee. So we wanted to do things a little bit different this time, and thus we reached out to 4 members from the accommodation committees, Dr. Lena Reyes, Dr. Ray Goldsmith, and Dr. Julia Huck, and Dr. Brent Barron. And we invited them to form a panel. So we would like to have a panel discussion today to be more to better engage audience for the discussions. Without further ado, and I would like to ask each of the panel members to tell us a little bit about themselves and what motivated them to serve on the accommodation committees. So who want to start first?
I can start. So I'm Lena Reese, and I am an associate professor at Oregon Health and Science University in the Oregon Hearing Research Center. I do research with hearing loss and cochlear implants, so I already have a motivation to be in the field because I myself have hearing loss. I have worn hearing aids for many years and have just recently got a cochlear implant. And so ever since my first meeting at ARO back in 1998, I have been very motivated to improve accessibility and accommodations for hearing loss. And now with this committee, we also have the opportunity to expand that to increase accessibility for other disabilities and limitations. I'll pass it on to Ray.
Thank you, Lena. I'm Ray Goldsworthy, and I'm an associate professor of otolaryngology at the University of Southern California. And I study hearing loss and cochlear implants, and am particularly interested in music appreciation after somebody gets a cochlear implant. And like Lena, you know, my motivation here is that I have hearing loss, and I had normal hearing up to the age of 13, and then had complete and sudden loss at that age through a bout with spinal meningitis. And so a year later, I was in the pediatric trials to get a cochlear implant. And then after getting a cochlear implant, I went through all the challenges of the education system being hearing impaired. And I was fortunate that I had other people advocate for me, particularly my mother. If it wasn't for her, I think my path in the education system would have been completely different. So when asked if I could serve in the Accessibility and Accommodations Committee, I said yes. And, you know, it's not like there's a one-size-fits-all solution. You know, we're trying to figure out what the best solutions are. And I'm really happy to work with the committee and with everybody to try to find out what those solutions are. And with that, I will pass it to Julia.
So my name's Julia Hike. I'm an associate professor at Kent State University. I kind of got interested in this stuff also, like the others, because of a history of being chronically ill, as well as hearing impaired, as well as a bunch of other things. So my experience comes initially from hearing impairment, because that's what happened to me first. And I learned to be an advocate for myself as a young child. And then later on, having lots of chronic illness and chronic pain, and those sorts of things gave me a broader perspective. So I was motivated to kind of continue that work. And part of it was even kind of getting hooked into disability Twitter. I don't know if any of you have ever been on disability Twitter, but it's quite a vibrant community. And so kind of finding that community was really helpful for me and helped motivate me to be where I am. I'll pass it on to you, Brad.
Hi, I'm Brad Buren. I'm a assistant research professor at Oregon.
I'm a deaf assistant research professor at Oregon.
Health and Science University.
The Health and Science University.
So I work at the same department as Nina,
So I work in the same department as Lena.
but not my hearing to meningitis
I lost my hearing to meningitis
when I was 13 months old.
when I was 14 months old.
So it was a meaningful hearing loss.
So it was a prelingual hearing loss.
And I grew up using good speed.
And I grew up using cued speech.
I later learned American Sign Language.
And then later learned American Sign
But I'm
Language.
using right now is good speed.
And what I'm using right now is cued speech.
I can reason I'm involved in this advocacy work.
And the reason I'm involved in this advocacy work
It's because I think it's very important for people to understand
is because I think it's very important for people to understand
the challenges and limitations that deaf people have
the challenges and limitations that deaf people have
in academia.
in academia.
All right, thank you all, and it's a very very inspiration to hear your story and your experience, and we would like to have audience to better engage this time. So we will open the floor now actually to the audience, and feel free to raise your hand and if you want to ask questions to the panels. And meanwhile, we also have some questions like we would like to start with, if that's okay. I think the first question that we would like to ask the panel is, what is the difference between accommodation and accessibility? As we know, there are lots of programs, they all provide accessible convenience for the people to join in. But could you give us a more insight into the difference between accommodation and accessibility?
I guess I can give a short answer, and the difference is generally accessibility is to make an event accessible to as many people as you can, so you can follow good practices. Like the one I like to illustrate is using the microphone. So when you're at the in-person conference, please use the microphone to ask questions instead of just yelling out the question from the audience. And that way everybody can hear, even the people with hearing loss, but also the people in the back of the room. So that's kind of maybe a broad example, but then accommodations would be more specific and tailored to the individual, and it's going to be different for each person. So you might offer a sign language interpreter, but maybe that person doesn't know sign language, and then you have to give captions. So then they're requesting a specific accommodation that's tailored to them. But I'm sure others might have more nuanced answers to that.
Yes, Brad.
Basically, accommodation is what makes something accessible.
Basically, an accommodation is what makes something accessible.
But the accommodation may vary depending on the person.
But the accommodation may vary depending on the person.
Like Lena mentioned, each person has different needs.
Each person has different needs.
Know sign language.
Some know sign language. Some use cued speech.
Some have residual hearing.
Some have residual hearing.
Some are profoundly deaf.
Some are profoundly deaf.
And so you really need to tailor the accommodation to the individual.
And so you really need to tailor the accommodations to the individual.
Some accommodations for a larger group of people.
Some accommodations work for a broader group of people.
But
we do try to make sure what we use works for as many people as possible.
Yes, well said. I think Lina actually gave us an example of what's made it generally accessible versus accommodation by using the microphone, right? That's a way to help people and to hear with hearing impairments to hear better. So I guess a follow-up question would be, can you tell us a little bit about accessibility issues that we should consider related to disabilities other than the hearing impairment? I know our group is more hearing impairment related, but there are other disabilities, right? Could you give us a little bit more about that?
I think that there's a lot of different, obviously there's, as many different disabilities as there are people, constellations of things and needs and what they are. But I think there's things that we can do to make things kind of our baseline more accessible. And then if additional accommodations are needed, we can go beyond that. So, one thing we can all do easily is we can make sure all of our graphics are colorblind friendly. So we can make sure we're using colorblind friendly palettes so that if someone cannot see the colors, they can still see our data, can still know what's going on. We can make sure our font sizes are good. We can provide materials in advance so that people who are visually impaired can blow them up or use text to speech so that they can have it read to them. People who with reading disabilities would also benefit from that, being able to use text to speech. So there's a lot, and of course there's spatial things, right? A lot of times the first thing, obviously we don't because we're ARO, but the first thing most people think about when they think about accessibility is physical accessibility, right? So is the space able to be navigated by someone with a walker or a wheelchair? Are there chairs for people to sit? So for example, I have some pretty severe chronic pain. Standing for 4 hours in a poster session is extremely painful for me, right? So to make it more accessible, you make sure there's chairs around so you can pull one over and sit. So, there's a lot of kind of physical things as well.
Yes, yeah, that's great. Great to hear all these tips to help accommodate. So next question, I would like to ask, what are certain challenges that are faced by members of the ARO community when requesting a specific accommodation or change in practice that would increase accessibility?
Before we get to that, Brad, did you have a question? Or
we are good. I can sort of answer this question.
Well, I guess I can sort of answer this question. But I was really trying to highlight something to
mention.
Oh, that they mentioned.
So basically, if we meet in the context of the current question.
So basically, to frame it in the context of the current question,
decide that people are set in their ways.
The challenge is that people are set in their ways.
For example,
scientists are very protective of their data.
Which means they're often not willing to share their poster or presentation.
Which means they're often not willing to share their posters or presentations.
Now, remember, our husband for 2 years.
Now, if you remember, ARO has been virtual for 2 years.
There was several talks.
There were several talks
where the presenter did not allow it to be recorded.
Where the presenter did not allow it to be recorded.
No, why is that happening?
Now, why is that a problem?
Well, sometimes the captioning did not work well.
Sometimes the captioning did not work well.
Sometimes it would drop out.
Sometimes it would drop out.
there would be times where the captioning would disappear for a minute or two.
There would be times where captioning would disappear for a minute or two.
I think about a deaf person or someone without visual impairment.
And think about a deaf person or someone who has visual impairment.
Which is they have a higher cognitive load.
They have a higher cognitive load.
They have to pay attention to activity and the poster or presentation.
They have to pay attention to everything on the poster or presentation.
Follow around with the talk.
While trying to follow along with the talk.
Sometimes the only solution is to go back after.
And sometimes the only solution is to go back after.
And back to talk again.
And watch the talk again.
The captioning map up.
If the captioning drops out, we
could have someone recaption it.
We could have someone recaption it.
Or if we miss something.
Or if we miss something.
Because we were too busy reading the talk.
Because we were too busy reading the talk.
The chat.
Oh, the chat, excuse me.
We can go back and look at the talk again.
We can go back and look at the talk again.
Because the presenter didn't allow it.
But it wasn't available because the presenter didn't allow it.
We miss out on that.
And so we miss out on that.
That really an example of the time.
And that's really an example of the challenge
that I sometimes have to deal with.
That I sometimes have to deal with.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting points to make, using caption and to help accommodating those who cannot see hear the voice well. But actually, there are a question raised by one of the audience, and so the question is, how would you make the following accessible without human caption? For example, when you are in a lab meeting, right, or in a seminar, or a one-on-one meeting or committee meeting or some training, and there's no caption available, how would you make those deal with those scenarios?
I have a question.
I have a question.
Why can't we use a human captioner?
Why can't we use a human captioner?
Oh, like in the event, there's no such a service available, like during a lab meeting or something, or just say a hallway talk, right, or in a conference at the poster, and when you go to the poster and you want to communicate with the presenters, what could we do to help them?
I think many of us have taken to using a lot of text, speech to text technology. So making sure there's a mic and letting someone speak into it so that we can do our own automatic captioning. But if any of you have turned on the automatic captioning today, you'll see that it is not always completely accurate, right? So it kind of depends on the accent as well as the audibility. So it's a partial solution. I think the biggest solution, aside from using the technology we have available to us, right, which is most of us have a phone in our pocket, and maybe making sure there's an extra mic that works maybe a little better than our phone or whatever in the lab, is to be aware, right? It's to kind of know that these situations are hard. To ask people if they want to communicate a different way. Is this challenging right now? Would you like to connect over email later? Like, I think being aware of the challenge is half of the solution.
Right. Yeah. Maybe speak slowly and repeat the sentence. I saw Ray and Lena both raise their hands, and they must have something to contribute. So Ray, you want to start? Or?
I do. I just want to second and third everything that Brad and Julia are saying, and often by the time I am muted now, they've already made the point, and Julia made it excellent there. which is, there are solutions, there are technical solutions that we can try, which are microphones and automatic captioning. Those are technical solutions. But at the heart of it, it's communication, and we have to put ourselves in the other person's shoes, understand where they're coming from. And sometimes that takes slowing down, not just, slowing down how you're communicating, but slowing down how you're interacting with the person, and that if you're communicating with somebody who has hearing loss or other challenge, sometimes, if a new student is in my lab, I get excited, I want to show him everything. And if I get excited, I might turn my back to them and talk too fast. And if I do that, then I'm not being accessible. And so I just want to second what Julia was saying and Brad was saying, and that it's really about interpersonal communication, slowing down and being nice and trying to understand what the other person needs.
Yes. How about Lena?
So I will, okay, so I will echo what Julia said about being prepared with a phone. And in answer to that question about lab interaction, I might go back pre-pandemic as well. And in those labs where you have wet lab work and you have to wear a mask, we were buying clear masks way before the pandemic started so that I could live with people who we were doing surgery with. So that would be something to consider if you have a deaf person in your lab and you need to do surgery and wear masks. The clear masks are something that are worth having. And then I think I would also say that a significant barrier, going back further to the previous question, is not just the cognitive load and the culture, but also money. And ARO luckily has always budgeted for this, but you might go to other conferences and they have not had as many people with hearing loss, and you ask for captioning and they don't have the money. And so we've recently been advocating with Acoustic Society of America, for example, to start budgeting for captioning. So that's something that's in the works now. So that's another obstacle, money, because captioning is very expensive and interpreters can also cost money.
And we've been fortunate in ARO to have the hearing loss be something people are aware of, and to have ARO be very good for hearing loss. But I will say that there's other aspects of accessibility that we don't necessarily budget for. So for example, this year's meeting, I think many of us are very glad is back in person. There is no hybrid option. Well, that's limiting for people who are medically fragile, who now, if they want to give a talk or a poster, if you have a student who's medically fragile, they're not able to participate in ARO this year. There's no way for them to do so because hybrid meetings are really expensive, right? So it's cost prohibitive to be inclusive.
Yeah, great point. And I remember the last ARO, although it didn't happen in person, but we were recommended to wear the clear mask, right, in order to facilitate communications. Speaking of the students, and we would like to hear your thoughts about when you're mentoring students, are there any tips and strategies that you would recommend that the students follow to seek accommodations when an event is not going to be accessible?
I think there's a bit of a follow-up question in the chat that's related that says, how much of a burden is put on an individual scientist to provide their own solutions to make meetings and events accessible?
So I brought up the budget issues, and I did see that question. And so that is well, I think certainly the scientists need to advocate for the need for the funding. But in my experience, at least with ERO and CIAP, the organizers have been very good about budgeting for grants. Or, for example, the Conference for Implantable Auditory Prosthesis would budget for captioning in their grant. And so the load was not on the scientists, but really on the organizers, which was very thoughtful.
I think there are aspects that are very much on the burden of the scientists, though, to provide their own solution. So if we're looking at someone who needs different accommodations, literally different place to stay, right? It might be more expensive for them to find a place that's close enough to the conference center. They're not going to be able to walk 2 miles, for example. And that's going to be on them or whatever money is sending them to the conference. If people need interpreters, some conferences are making the scientists get their own transliterators or own interpreters. So I think there is quite a bit that's still, there's the things that we've come to think of as more standard, and fortunately, captioning is getting more and more standard, right? But there are things that are still considered to be, we only do this if there's an individual who needs it, and then they better figure it out. And I think there's a lot of that. So I think that still is an issue.
So in
terms of
burden,
a burden,
as a student, when I was in college and medical school,
as a student, when I was in college, then graduate school,
it was pretty easy.
It was pretty easy.
I went to the disability office.
I went to the disability office.
Filled out some paperwork.
Filled out some paperwork.
And I had basically a designated translator.
And I had basically a designated transliterator.
But I mean by that is someone who works with me the whole time.
And what I mean by that is someone who worked with me the whole time.
Same person.
The same person
available.
Was always available.
For classes.
For classes.
Groups.
Study groups.
Lab. Really, everything.
Training, everything.
That made it super accessible.
And that made it super accessible.
On top of that, my classmates learned how to queue.
On top of that, my classmates learned how to queue.
Which was awesome.
Which was awesome.
But then, when I became a postdoc.
But then when I became a postdoc.
There was no mechanism in the.
There was no mechanism in place.
And with the university to do that effort.
And many universities that.
At least the two I worked at.
At least the two I worked at.
As a postdoc had the expectation.
As a postdoc, they had the expectation.
That the department pay for the services.
That the department pay for the services.
And that get expensive.
And that can get expensive.
For department.
For department.
And it didn't seem fair to me.
And it didn't seem fair to me.
And finally, my university.
OHU.
They have agreed to cover the cost from a central budget.
They have agreed to cover the cost from a central budget.
And now, whenever I need an interpreter.
And now, whenever I need an interpreter.
I don't have to find them myself.
I don't have to find them myself.
I email someone in the central office.
I email someone in the central office.
And they have to take care of everything for me.
And they have to take care of everything for me.
Everything they did that.
It's been great ever since they did that.
But before the old pain to work with.
But before the old
culture,
culture was a pain to work with.
Yeah. Okay.
I guess I'm curious to know about the experiences at other institutions. Are there folks in the audience who can contribute some insight as to how it works in your particular institution? Is there a disability office that would handle things like they did in graduate school institutions? Are there places where it's been more difficult?
Right, I saw both Ray and Julia had raised their hands, and maybe they can have some thoughts. I think self advocacy can be hard and fatigue. So
I think that it really does depend on your stage. I think we do have decent protections within institutions and support within institutions. Sometimes if you have an established problem, if you become disabled while a student, that's much, much harder because you have to do the documentation. It can take easily 6 to 8 months to get your accommodations, at which point you've completed a semester and a half. So if you become disabled while a student, it's much harder than if you already are, and this is something you're used to. The other thing I'd say is that faculty don't get that kind of support. So there isn't a disability office for faculty. You have to go through HR. And I would say that HR is designed to try to limit the amount of money spent on accommodations in most cases. Obviously, there are going to be exceptions to that. But for the most part, I would say that HR's job is to try to do the legal minimum, right? It's set up to do something that is based on the legality of something instead of based on making it truly accessible. So that limits things for faculty. It was raised as a possibility for me before I had grants when I had to teach, because we have a pretty high teaching load. I had to teach 5 days a week, and it was destroying my body. I couldn't do anything because I was in so much pain the rest of the day after teaching every single morning. And it was suggested to me that I should go to HR and get them to change my schedule. Well, if you change your schedule, your colleagues hate you. If you make them change their course schedule because you're in pain, you do not become popular, right? And if you're pre-tenured, you need to be popular. So it's something I never did because I couldn't be the enemy. So I think that it really does depend on your stage and what exactly you need for an accommodation.
Yeah, I agree with that. I want to first highlight Brad's success as a PhD student and working with the disabilities office, and that was very effective. And for a student, you want that champion, and you want the disabilities office to help you, to advocate for you, and to find the services. Hopefully, they're experienced and they know the different types of accommodation that can be helpful for you, and they can help you get those. But then there's this gray area as a postdoc and as faculty where it becomes more difficult, and a lot of the advocacy comes back to you. It is self-advocacy, and you have to figure out how to come up with a solution. So with the pandemic and everything going on Zoom, I'm hosting workshops for cochlear implant users on music appreciation online, and they weren't captioned because we're using Zoom. And so I went to the disabilities office, and they recognized it as a problem, but there's this layer of bureaucracy that you can often run into because they're trying to work out these large scale deals with Zoom. And so I started recognizing, that's not going to be an effective short-term solution. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen quickly. I'm not going to get Zoom captioned until Zoom figures it out and the university makes their deal with Zoom to make that happen, which fortunately it has now. And so when you're self-advocating, you sometimes have to look for the quickest solution to the problem. Again, ideally, somebody else is advocating for you. Somebody else has that knowledge, has that expertise, and is going to help you out. But sometimes you have to look at the specifics of the event and say, well, if I need to make this happen, what can I do to make this happen? And for us, we used Google Meet because they were much more, we got the caption, we're doing it, it's free, we got the captioning for you. And so there was that solution was there, where the disabilities office, is going to take their time and to make it happen. So sometimes you have to be flexible, and you have to look at what is the event and how can I work with the people who are in charge of the event, not go to the disabilities office or go to the disabilities office, but if they're not being helpful and you want to solve that problem, sometimes you do. But yes, that is a burden on whoever's trying to self-advocate.
I think Lena had something.
Yes, so I would just like to follow up and go back to a question about how do you help a student? And we've been talking mainly from the self-advocacy point of view, but I noticed many people in the audience here are hearing-abled faculty. And you might be wondering how you can help a student with hearing loss. And so I just kind of want to point out, we talked a lot about captioning and interpreters, but there's a lot of people who have moderate, severe hearing loss who, or are deaf. And they might benefit, as Ray said, from you remembering to face them when you talk and slow down and also look at their understanding, access to understanding. So I have actually had people with hearing loss, students with hearing loss in my lab. And then I had to learn and make myself remember to face them when I was talking. It's easy to just go look at the computer and say, hey, here's the figure, and then forget to look at them. And so that's something really important to remember. But also, when I was in graduate school, my PI, Eric Young, he bought me an assistive listening system. And I have to say that I did not want to use it at the time. I never used it in college. And I had to read from the textbook, basically. But because he bought me the FM system, I was forced to use it. And I was amazed at how much easier it made things for me. And I could attend class. And Eric Young was one of those people that forgot to turn around when he was lecturing. And he'd be writing equations in the blackboard. And he would be talking. But I could understand him with the FM. So, that said, the FM system's not for everybody. But when I've had students with hearing loss in my lab, I have made the point to buy them an FM if I judge that they could benefit from it. So if they're deaf and they're in denial, they think they don't need it, but I notice that they do have a little trouble, I encourage them and buy them the FM. And I would encourage you to have that conversation with your student if they have hearing loss, or if they have another disability, and also have them connect with someone else with that similar type of disability to find out what would work for them. If you don't have a disability and you don't know what they need, it might be helpful to connect them to someone else for advice.
Tina, could you tell us a little bit more? What is the system, the FM system? What does it do for the student?
I'm sorry. It's an assistive listening device, and it can be different technologies, but basically it's a microphone that the speaker uses, and it's just like, the lapel mic that you might use when giving a talk. And then there's a receiver that the person with hearing loss wears, and it could be a headphone, or it could be something that's an inductive neck loop, which is more hearing aid compatible or cochlear implant compatible. But it's basically, the idea is you increase the signal to noise ratio so you can hear the person as if they were standing right next to you. And it reduces the noise from other sound sources. It usually costs about $5,000 or $6,000, or it could cost that much. So that's something that the department should be able to cover, or you ask for it in the supplement when you apply for an R1 supplement.
We have a question from Peter Steiger before we move on.
Can I just say something?
University should pay for it, not the department. The university should pay for it.
University should pay for it, not the department.
Now it may take
Now, it may take a lot of work, but
I believe the university should be responsible, not the department.
But I believe the university should be responsible, not the department.
Because the department makes hiring decisions.
Because the department makes hiring decisions.
So it does want that department to fear that they may be taking on a financial burden.
So you don't want the department to feel like they may be taking on a financial burden.
Okay.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt.
Sorry to interrupt.
No worries. It's good to see everybody here. So a couple of things. First off, with purchasing assistive listening devices, my strategy has been to get the university to pay out of the indirect costs. So it doesn't come out of the university's general budget, it comes out of the indirect costs from the grant. But what I really wanted to talk about was additional routes of assistive listening devices. Now, Lena talked about an FM system, and I'm sure others have here, and that's very good. But there's a new kind of technology that's been out for a few years, which is Bluetooth. And I use that from my PC or my phone to my hearing aids, and it's even better than an FM. If you can use your residual hearing, try and get some sort of Bluetooth connectivity to your hearing devices. It is so much better, so much clearer, and that's really all I wanted to say, is really tap that technology. I've only had it 6 months, and my life has been revolutionized as a result. So thank you.
There's a question from Patricia White before we move to Julia, who also has her hand.
I just wanted to say that my university has generated materials for advisors who are taking on deaf students to help them become a little bit better at deaf awareness. And if you like, I can share that with the group.
That would be terrific. Please do share it either by sending it to us and we'll post it to the resources page, or if you have it on hand, please post it to the chat as well.
I'll post it to the chat.
Thank you.
I was going to say that part of what I think we'd like to stress is that any of these kind of communications with anyone with a disability is about making sure you're having that talk. So I have 2 students right now that are neurodiverse, and they actually have the same diagnosis. And one of them in a meeting records the meeting and goes back and listens to it later, because that's the best way for them to pay attention in the meeting, is not to be taking notes and to be listening, and comes back and takes notes later. The other one couldn't possibly function that way. And what she does instead is she turns on the transcribe feature in Microsoft Word, which I showed her how to do. And it transcribes everything said during the meeting so she can read it later, because she's not going to use her auditory modality if she doesn't have to. Now, again, these are 2 students with the same diagnoses. So this is about listening to them and figuring out for them the best way to make these meetings work. Both had the same problem. Things happened in meetings and they couldn't remember that they happened, right? But the solutions were different.
So, going back to the idea of what you can do to support me.
So going back to the idea of what you can do to support training.
Keep in mind, if you have a medium to nap.
Keep in mind, if you have a
medium to nap.
If you have a medium to large lab.
That means may not be fully aware of everything that is going on.
The trainee may not be fully aware of everything that is going on.
And incidenter.
Because they miss out on incidental hearing.
They miss out at the conversation you are happy with the student sitting next to them.
They miss out on the conversation you were having with the student sitting next to them.
So they may not know about something coming up, just to keep that in mind.
So they may not know about something coming up, just to keep that in mind.
Mm.
I think that's great discussion. I think I learned a lot, and there's a great resources, and I think some of the resources recommended today will be made available at ARODI website, right? So Eddie would put all these resources there.
Ali also dropped a little note in the chat that says, if you have additional resources that you'd like to share with the community, please email directly to ARO. I'm scrolling because there's lots of comments that were coming in.
Headquarters at aro.org.
Headquarters at aro.org. And they will organize the resources both within the resources that you find for diversity and minority affairs. And I know that the Accommodations and Accessibility Committee is also maintaining a set of resources. So we're actively looking to make sure that we share the information across the community so that we can all benefit from the pieces of information that individuals are gathering. Since I've got the floor, the other point that reminder I wanted to give you is that we would love to hear feedback about this session and other ideas. We have a survey that you will find in the chat, and Ali will put it again at your convenience. Please fill that out after or during the meeting. While I was talking, there are lots of comments that came in on chat, so I'm going to mute myself so I can read those. Please continue the discussion. Anybody from the floor, feel free to ask a question.
Well, did you want to go on, Radha?
No, you've got the floor, Lena. Go for it.
Well, I don't know if you're reading from the chat out loud, but I might just emphasize Julia's point that it's really important if you have a student with a disability to have that conversation with them. They may not initiate it. They might be afraid to talk with you about it. And so it's probably up to you to initiate that conversation and make it a safe space and make them feel comfortable to share what they need. That's all I want.
Sometimes it's about figuring it out together. Sometimes you're in a situation that's new for the student. They've never been in a lab before. They haven't had to do bench work. The strategies that have worked in other scenarios may not be working for them now. So sometimes it's about troubleshooting together, not just listening, but actually working together.
Do you find that students can be resistant to this conversation, or individuals?
I think you have to make a safe space first, right? Like, just like anytime we're talking about diversity and inclusion, right? You need to create a space where you can have the conversation for it to be effective, right? If it seems like you're asking because it might be an inconvenience, they're not going to want to talk to you. So I think it's about creating an environment. One of the ways I do that, which I changed a couple of years ago, is when I talk to my students, I tell them that I'm disabled and that I've got chronic illness. And I tell them that there's stuff I'm dealing with that I don't think they can get. And I'm sure there's things they're dealing with that I don't get. And we start there, right? Because for me, that's a way to open the door, right? So I think for different people, it's different things, but you got to start with having trust. Otherwise, this isn't going to work. I didn't use any amplification or anything other than like preferential seating until I was in grad school. So it was new to me. I didn't know what I was doing. So, you know, it just depends.
Yeah, I want to add to that, Radha. Yes, there's some students may be resistant to it. They may be uncomfortable for some people. As you can imagine, you know, if I was sat down and somebody said, Ray, you're deaf, is that going to cause any problems? You know, it said it like that, I'd be like, whoa, what? I mean, you could imagine if you said that with anything else. Radha, you're a woman in science. Is that going to cause any trouble if you go up the ranks, or, you know, if you're called out for how you're different? You know, there's a wrong way to do it. And so creating that safe space, as Julia mentioned, and seeing what they're comfortable with, and just saying, well, what can I do to help with, you know, get you what you need to be successful, and just creating that environment is the important thing.
And as was just mentioned in the chat, some universal design components, like turning on auto captions whenever you have a talk, regardless of whether you know someone's hearing impaired or deaf in the room, like recording your lectures so that if a student's not able to make it because they are sick, they can go back and look at it later. Some general, always doing things colorblind friendly, regardless of whether you know there's a colorblind person. Universal design helps kind of start that conversation, and also I think signals that you're more welcoming and accepting. If you're already starting from a place of trying to be inclusive, students see that asking you to take additional steps may not be that big of a deal.
Yeah, I think that's a terrific point. This idea that if you make one step, then more steps sort of can be discussed, and the first step is sort of the important thing to start. A great point, Julia. Tilak also has some comments and resources that he's been posting on the chat, so please take a look at that. He mentioned that if you're using PowerPoint or Google Slides, you can very easily turn on an auto caption feature as well when you're recording lectures.
There are so many useful information in the chat. I suggest you save the chat and so you can look at them later.
And I think unlike other coffee hour sessions, we did record this one. So presumably Ali will have access to this, the entire session and the chat. Is that right? She says that's correct. So. I invite members of the audience to take this opportunity to ask questions. There's a question in chat. What was the Twitter for hearing aids? That's a question to you, Julia.
There's hashtags on Twitter. Disabled in higher ed is one of them. Basically, neurodiverse squad would be one. There's whole lots of disability Twitter. So if you go onto Twitter and you start looking for people who are talking about disability, obviously for us, often disabled in higher ed is one of the best ones. But there's just a lot there. You know, and as I said, people who support each other, because a lot of times if it's communities that either have trouble socially or have trouble getting out of the house, having this online community can be very, very helpful.
So I'm seeing that the pace of the questions is winding down as we're hitting the last 2 minutes of our session. I'd like to remind people to please respond to the survey so that we can build on these activities to continue to support an inclusive environment for our community. I'd also like to invite you all to join us at ARO for a workshop session that the Diversity and Minority Affairs Committee is hosting. And we will for sure share the this session so that you can see all the tremendous comments that are coming in within that session.
Radha, there's a question from Manita.
Oh.
She's asking, does ARO ensure that meeting spaces are good acoustically?
Yeah, I just meant, you know, like let fewer reflections, and, you know, these hotels tend to have huge glass windows and it's so terrible. So I don't know how one would make sure of that.
So I might answer that. Maybe a few years ago, maybe several years ago, we did have some ARO meetings where the poster sessions were very, very loud. And so we did advocate in one of those letters that we make sure to have rooms that have carpet and then soft walls. And I think certain acoustical properties, I can't remember if it's high ceilings or not high ceiling. And then also to have the posters farther apart, because then you have less density. And I think that's also good for physical accessibility.
Yeah, I think we have a long ways to go there.
I think most of these locations are designed for holding lots of people, not for being accessible in any way.
I think in poster sessions in the past, I know Ray has said that he often invites people to come out of the poster session to have a one-on-one conversation because it's just too hard to talk in that resonant space.
I think the diversity committee is having another meeting with the long range planning committee, so we can definitely bring this and start the conversation there.
Okay. Okay, I'd like to thank our panel members, Ray, Lena, Julia, and Brad. Thank you so much for coming to share your insights with us. And I will call the session closed. Thank you all, Jeff, for monitoring the session.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much. Happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you. See you all at ARO.
Yeah.